Good afternoon. This conversation could not be more timely, and we're thrilled to have you join us. Some of you may have seen the images of the Haitian asylum seekers gathered under the Del Rio International Bridge in Texas, and the images of brutality of Border Patrol agents. The administration's plan is already underway to send mass deportations and expulsion flights to Haiti, with 7 deportations planned just for today. These actions are closely connected to the report you'll be hearing from today, and you'll get some insight into the historical patterns of the U.S. and other nations to push asylum seekers, particularly Black asylum seekers, out of their borders. Our thoughts are with those in Del Rio and so many other people seeking safety and a chance to rebuild their lives. Through our clinics at the National Immigrant Justice Center, our pro bono partners, and our in-house team, NIJC is committed to providing critical legal services to those in need of protection, including Haitians, while advocating for an immigration system that embraces our asylum obligations and respect for our shared humanity. As the Executive Director of the National Immigrant Justice Center, I am pleased to welcome you, and I thank you for your interest and your own advocacy to ensure that we as a country are upholding both our international and our domestic laws. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Meg. We're really thrilled to have you all today with everything that's going on in particular, and immensely grateful as well that Maria Garcia from Forward.us is joining us. The purpose of the presentation today is to share with you some of the findings of our report that was jointly presented with between NIJC and Forward. Before we dive in, I just wanted to share a couple of things about NIJC. You all may know this already, but we are an organization that blends different forms of advocacy and legal services. We serve 9,000 plus, I believe this past year, 10,000 non-citizens every year with 5 offices across the country. The policy office is mainly based in DC, but we also have a litigation office and provide services in Indiana, in San Diego, and also at the border for individuals who are subject to remain in Mexico policies in Texas. And we have a very huge network of pro bono attorneys, as Mary Meg mentioned. The purpose of today's conversation, again, it has to do with this report that we've issued jointly with Forward. The report will be dropped as a link to you all by chat. And essentially what we're talking about today is the notion of offshoring asylum. So to get us started, one question that we have for you all is what you think about when you think about offshoring asylum. What does that conjure up for you? What images come up, and we'll be answering that question ourselves in relation to the report today. So it will be really interesting for us to hear what your perspective is on that. So in terms of how we'll be breaking this down, we'll be first talking about the issue and why this matters and who it's impacting. We'll be then switching over to what international law says and how basically nations are offshoring or externalizing asylum protection. And then, of course, we'll end with what you can do in response to all of this information and as you get activated on this important topic. We'll be trying to save 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end, but you're welcome to drop questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them as they come as well. So at this point, I'm going to pass it on to Maria, and who's going to get us started with this issue.
Thank you, Azadeh, and thank you, NIJC, for having me today. My name is Maria Garcia. I'm the Research Director at Forward.us. And as others have already mentioned, this issue is sort of at the forefront of what's happening with asylum policy, not only in the United States, but around the world. And our report, Pushing Back Protection, How Offshoring and Externalization Imperil the Right to Asylum, it's sort of the culmination of over a year of research, including conversations with international experts on asylum law and on offshoring and externalization policies. And what we set out to do was really sort of recognizing this increasing trend of what we call affluent nations or powerful nations working to prevent asylum seekers from reaching their borders, but more importantly, from getting anywhere near their borders. And so as we sort of dived into this topic, we realized that it was something sort of happening all over the world, and wanting to sort of view this asylum policy and people, vulnerable people in need of protection and being turned away in a global lens. And sort of that was sort of the catalyst for this project. I think we could go to the next slide. Thank you. Excuse me, I have a raspy voice today. So as I said, nations around the world are working to halt the arrival of asylum seekers. They are doing whatever they can, including violating international and their own domestic laws, to push them back. So it's not just, in the case of the United States, it's not just people at the southern border anymore. The United States border has moved much further south. And the two of the tactics that we look at in this report are offshoring and border externalization. So offshoring is when a country, a destination country, sends asylum seekers to other nations or territories for processing, if they are processed at all, and detention. Border externalization, we sort of use this in a, specifically as it relates to proxy border control or border enforcement. So that's where a destination country essentially hires or coerces a neighboring country to act as their border guard. And I can give some examples at the top of some of these policies. So offshoring, if we're talking about offshoring and the history of the United States, Azadeh is going to talk a bit later about policies related to Guantanamo Bay and the detention of asylum seekers there. There also was the safe third country agreements under the Trump administration. In the EU, we can look at the EU-Turkey statement, where individuals who arrive in Greece are returned to Turkey and are meant to be processed there. And then obviously Australia sort of holding and offshoring people to islands in the Pacific Ocean. When we're looking at border externalization, again, that's the sort of hiring, enlisting, coercing neighboring countries to act as a border guard. In the United States, we can point to policies not only in the Trump administration, but the Biden administration as well, who has brokered deals with Mexico and Central America, and even further south, to sort of militarize their borders and their interior, again, to keep people away from the United States. I'm going to talk a bit later about the proxy border control or border enforcement example, one of the more sort of acute, explicitly horrific ones in the EU, and that's the memorandum of understanding between Italy and Libya. With that, I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, who is impacted by these policies? There are obviously millions of people on the move right now that are in need of protection, and many of these individuals are being impacted by offshoring and externalization policies. And these people are being intercepted and turned away, both at sea and by land and on land. And one of these policies are often, the history of these policies, you can trace them back, they're often used as forms of racial exclusion. And if we look at sort of during World War II, the United States, this example is one of the more known examples of offshoring and externalization, where the United States turned away thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust, including many at sea who were returned to their deaths. And what we're seeing right now in recent decades is that these policies are designed and enforced against people who are Black, people who are brown, Indigenous asylum seekers. And these policies are directed at them, and this is the result is unimaginable human suffering. And our report starts off with sort of exploring legal vehicles for these policies to take place, but also looking at international asylum obligations, so sort of setting up the rest of the report, which includes case studies in the regions I just mentioned. But one of the sort of guiding pieces of this project was really to sort of ground it in the human impact, which is devastating. And so we're going to talk a bit more about these different strategies and sort of ground this presentation in the human consequences of these policies. I think we can go, I'm going to pass it back to Ozde. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. So before we dive too deep, we wanted to start us off with this quote from an asylum seeker who is in the northern city of Calais in France, where a lot of asylum seekers have been camping out for years. The chapter 2 of our report actually dives into the conditions there and the French response and the UK response, because a lot of these asylum seekers are trying to make it to the United Kingdom and cross over from France. So this asylum seeker says, and he is a youth, a 17-year-old, that their strategy is to weaken us. But if everything was fine in our countries, we wouldn't have left. We don't have the choice. And why that is an important thing to keep in mind is that it really puts its finger on the role of deterrence that these countries are centralizing in their policies. So the goal is always to make the conditions so unbearable, so so cruel, truly, that asylum seekers will be deterred and will actually not want to come to seek refuge. And that doesn't work. That's not, that fundamentally misunderstands the reasons why people leave, which are not born out of choice. But it also shows that, behind all of these legal technicalities, which we're going to be talking about in a moment, there's, is basically masquerading plain cruelty. So on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about basically what these carve-outs have been about. So international law in terms of asylum was born out of World War II, and in 1951 and in 1967, there were two key treaties that nations entered into voluntarily. And as you can see, the vast majority of nations in the world are members of those treaties. That means that they have engaged themselves to abide by the obligations that are in those treaties. And one key obligation is what is the French word of non-refoulement, which refers to basically the principle of not pushing back asylum seekers, people who are coming to seek safety to any place or country where they may face persecution or torture. That principle is carved into both of the treaties that I just referred to, the 1951 Refugee Convention, as well as the 1967 Refugee Protocol. Despite the fact that the vast majority of these nations have said that they will not just follow that principle, but codify it into their domestic laws, we have seen patterns over the past few decades of violations of that principle. So that's what we're going to be talking about next. So in terms of the two strategies that Maria already mentioned, offshoring and border externalization, those, in fact, are basically ways to try to get around the obligation of non-refoulement that we were just talking about. So non-refoulement is quite simple. There's no exception to it. There's no, there's no loophole in it. Nevertheless, countries have tried to find ways in which they can either offload that responsibility onto another nation in the form of transferring refugees to that nation, or what we've been calling offshoring, or tasking other nations with preventing the arrival of refugees at their borders. Because at the end of the day, when somebody doesn't make it to the border, then you're not liable for pushing them back. So that's what Maria was referring to when she was sharing the notion of proxy border enforcement. And that's something that we've seen across administrations, and certainly the Biden administration espousing from its very beginning months and at its leadership. The very goal of these obligations is to skirt international law. And no, we can go to the next slide. The Maria is going to basically start us off in terms of what it looks like at a geographical level, at a practical level, to violate the proxy border control, to implement this proxy border control strategy.
Thank you. This photo is really a disturbing image, one of many. That is the Libyan Coast Guard and a dinghy which was carrying asylum seekers who drowned and who died in the Mediterranean in 2019. As I said, this is just one of many mass drownings that have happened in the Mediterranean. And this is directly the result of these policies of countries preferring to, quite frankly, let people drown or be pulled back to dangerous conditions rather than reach their territories. So in this example of proxy border control, we wanted to sort of illustrate the lengths that the affluent countries, the powerful countries, will go to prevent arrivals. In 2012, Italy was found at the European Court of Human Rights to have violated the non-refoulement principle because they physically intercepted asylum seekers at sea themselves, brought them onto Italian vessels, and returned them to harm. So they were found to have violated that principle. What they have since done is used a proxy border control to do the violations essentially for them, to physically return people to harm so that they don't have to deal with the legal fallout. And in 2017, Italy and Libya signed a memorandum of understanding where in exchange for, I think it was 400 to 500 million euros and resources and other support, Libya would act as the border guard for Italy and the EU to halt arrivals to Italy and Europe. The Libyan Coast Guard was essentially sort of created and recruited due to these policies, including from smuggling networks. They're not equipped to rescue people at sea, and if they are, they're pulled back to danger. So essentially how this works, although it doesn't work, is that Italy and the EU's border agency Frontex, they fly reconnaissance flights and they locate dinghies and boats and things with sea vessels with asylum seekers and migrants. And they tell the Libyan Coast Guard, instead of charity NGO ships, which are better equipped to help them and often closer, they tell the Libyan Coast Guard where they are, and the Libyan Coast Guard is therefore supposed to intercept them, push them back, pull them back to Libya. Libya is in the middle of a civil war. Migrants and asylum seekers in Libya face indefinite detention, extreme violence, including torture and sexual violence, and a large share of the asylum seekers and migrants detained in Libya are children. Despite all of this, despite sort of international sort of condemnation from human rights organizations and the UN. This memorandum of understanding was renewed earlier this year without any amendments. Again, just sort of going back to, I just want to really illustrate this point, just how far these nations are willing to go to keep people away from their borders. And just I'll close with, The Guardian has reported extensively on this policy and other externalization practices in Europe. And in one investigation, there were transcripts where the EU Frontex, the border agency, alerted the Libyan Coast Guard as I think it was about 10 dinghies distressed at sea. And the Libyan Coast Guard replied much too late, saying that it was a holiday and perhaps they could be there tomorrow. The direct result of that was hundreds of people drowning, which was widely reported about in Europe. But I think that this is sort of one of the different offshoring externalization tactics, that of proxy border control. But Azadeh is going to talk about another tactic related to refugee transfer regimes.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So speaking of disturbing images, what you see at the very top is Haitians being held in Guantanamo Bay, a practice that began in the late 1980s and went into the 1990s. Nowadays, the Guantanamo Bay is obviously infamous for its usage in the war on terror and the ways in which especially Middle Eastern men and African men have been held there indefinitely without trial. Well, before that, the US had piloted the use of the island, the military base on Cuba's island, in order to hold Haitian asylum seekers. So that was, in a way, the first implementation of refugee transfer regimes from the US. It was the first time that the US received a large number of asylum seekers, and its response was repressive at heart. So its response was to either send boats of asylum seekers back to the conditions that they were fleeing, which was a brutal dictatorship in Haiti, or to transfer them to a military base where they were held in abhorrent conditions. And in many ways, those practices, which began offshoring at a worldwide level, were passed on as tips or best practices to other nations, and particularly Australia, which you see below. So Australia, right after in the early 2000s, began its own offshoring program in close consultation with the US, which traded tips and best practices again on how to transfer people who arrive at its shores. And all of that began for Australia with about 400 asylum seekers from Afghanistan who had arrived by boat. And in many ways, Australia's response was similar to patterns that we've seen in the EU as well as in the US, which was a form of race-based panic, seeing the asylum seekers as invaders, seeing them as queue jumpers, as criminals, as potential terrorists. And from that rhetoric, building layers of policies that ended up strong-arming 2 islands in the Pacific into holding these asylum seekers indefinitely on those islands. And there's been many deaths, there's been suicides. Children were born in those islands because they were, individuals were held for so long, families were held for so long. And to this day, there continues to be asylum seekers there, even though they haven't transferred asylum seekers to the islands of Nauru and Manus, which are in the Pacific. One of the really disturbing aspects of these refugee transfer regimes is a power imbalance that we see between the destination nation, such as the United States or Australia, and the nation or the territory where asylum seekers end up being transferred. So to give you an example, Manus Island is part of Papua New Guinea. Nauru is its own independent nation. However, both of them used to be at one point either a protectorate or a colony of Australia. Similarly, Guantanamo Bay used to be Cuban territory. It was actually leased to the United States at the turn of the 20th century upon Cuba's independence from Spain, where basically many U.S. officials, including U.S. senators and high members of the U.S. cabinet, wanted to annex Cuba to the United States, and they struck a compromise and leasing the what is now known as the military base in Guantanamo Bay ended up being that compromise. So in many ways, it's about sort of, ensuring that asylum seekers who the US does not want to receive or Australia does not want to receive are pushed back to nations that are less fortunate and that are strong-armed into receiving them. So switching to the next slide, I know we're very close on running out of time. Just want to share 3 major issues that we've been tracking in our report and on NIJC's website. So the Trump administration, it's very well known at this point, has waged an incredible, set of attacks. There are a barrage of policies that were anti-asylum. We tracked those policies for 4 years, and we've also been tracking what Biden has been doing upon taking office. And to make a long story short, those policies included at least 2 forms of refugee transfer regimes, and with Title 42, a form of expulsion or pushback that leaned in again on proxy border control and the forms of border externalization that we've been talking about as well. And again, to in a nutshell, the Biden administration has really not had a good record in any way. The first of those forms of refugee transfer regimes, which is safe third country agreements brokered with Central American nations, that was the only one that they actually terminated and rescinded. But the migrant protection protocols or remain in Mexico, they initially terminated, and then they were forced by a court to reinstate the program. And rather than terminate it again on the basis of the extensive record of atrocities, they have purportedly been contemplating ways to kickstart a light version of the program, which advocates, including NIJC, have found to be an impossible endeavor given the human rights violations and the violations of international law that are baked into Remain in Mexico. And then the last thing is the Biden administration has literally expelled hundreds of thousands of people and continues to do so today. Literally today, as Mary Meg started us off, they are sending planes that are full of expelled individuals back to Haiti without doing any screenings. That is basically the basic definition of pushbacks. But that policy is permitting that under the guise of public health, and is very much a continuation of a Trump and Stephen Miller policy with respect to weaponizing public health for asylum purposes. So we're just going to close with one last quote, and I'll pass it on to Maria.
Thank you. Again, just going back to the human consequences and the human impact, what we found in our research is that there was actually a lot of survivors that were speaking out about obviously the horrific things that they endured in their country of origin, and then their journey to get to a destination country, but also the impact that these externalization offshoring policies have had. We just wanted to share one more quote from an asylum seeker. This individual is a asylum seeker from Sudan who survived a shipwreck in the Mediterranean, and he stated, "Before the departure, some of the migrants told me that they had dreams. They were simple dreams. They just wanted to have a normal life. But instead of being able to pursue their dreams in their own country, they had to choose the path of exile. For them, it was the only solution. When a European is the victim of a tragedy, the whole world mobilizes. But when hundreds of Africans drown, nobody seems concerned. Is humanity's conscience dead?" Do we have time to highlight some of these policy recommendations, Azadeh? Yeah?
We do. We have more time. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So as part of the report, we provide some policy recommendations. We pulled out a few here, and I can sort of just read these, and they're available in the report as well, as far as several others. But we are calling on the United States and the Biden administration to divest from a crisis management response and invest in domestic asylum processing systems, shielding asylum seekers in the US from short-term politically motivated policies. Further, there is no right way to seek asylum. The US can't abide by the principle of non-refoulement by ascribing blame and fault to asylum seekers depending on their mode of entry. It's also critical that the US and the Biden administration close legal loopholes that skirt the non-refoulement obligations. And this is also key to enforcing asylum protections. It's imperative that the US restore the broad scope of non-refoulement obligations, particularly as it relates to fulfilling these obligations under international and domestic law. And then finally, harsh deterrence policies don't work. Asylum seekers don't leave their homes voluntarily. Abandoning these measures is key to ending offshoring and border externalization once and for all. Azadeh, is there anything else you wanted to add here?
Just that, yeah, I think those are very much what we're seeing today. In terms of there is no right way to seek asylum, one particular thing that is striking is that the administration in late July issued a statement that said that they were committed to return any boats that were apprehended of Cubans and Haitians, and that there's basically that was the wrong way to come to the United States. So in other words, the very rhetoric that the administration was using was misunderstanding the ways in which asylum law works. Because again, as Maria said, there's no right way to come to seek protection. The result of that is also that the administration has reiterated its commitment to send asylum seekers apprehended at sea to third countries for processing. So relinquishing again or abdicating its responsibility in relation to these asylum seekers. The last thing to note is obviously we started off by talking about the situation at the border in relation to Haitians. This situation, we believe the report sheds light to the historical impact of the ways in which basically anti-asylum policies were piloted off the back of Haitians. In many ways, the US has done some of its worst record with respect to asylum seekers is manifest in terms of the actions it has taken vis-a-vis Haitian asylum seekers. So we have tried to connect those dots again in a commentary that we'll post in the chat as well. And we hope that can be useful to you all as you're navigating our report, which is admittedly a bit longer and a longer read for when you have more time on your hands. So please feel free to share the report to read it. There are, again, there's 3 different geographical case studies that you can dive into in relation to the EU, Australia, and the United States, both pre-Trump and post-Trump. You can also visit our respective websites, and we would urge you to really lift up some of these urgent needs in terms of, policies such as terminating the Remain in Mexico policy, which we believe is, again, embedded in externalization, ending Title 42 expulsions and the deportation blitz that we're seeing at the US border today in relation to Haitians, educating your community, staying informed, spreading the word. There's really not enough noise in relation to what's been happening to asylum seekers over the past several years, and we really think that engagement within your community can go a long way in terms of changing the course of US policies and by extension worldwide policies, since we know that these nations are borrowing from each other and looking at each other's actions in terms of setting their own domestic policies. And of course, you are more than welcome, if you're a pro bono attorney, if you're an attorney interested in immigration law, to contact our pro bono manager, Ellen Miller, and getting involved in terms of taking on clients for representation. We currently have 48 clients who are in need of representation, and that need keeps on growing. So please feel free to reach out if you have capacity. And I'll just pass it on to Maria for one last piece on how to get involved.
Thank you. I see, so Heidi's just put it in the chat as well, but we've shared an Act Blue fundraising page for one of our partners, the Haitian Bridge Alliance, who is on the ground in Del Rio, Texas, and is assisting Haitians and other Black immigrants and asylum seekers there, getting them food, transportation, accommodation, and there's lots of needs, including sort of legal services and translation. The list goes on and on. So they need all of our help and our love. So if you're able to share that fundraiser and sort of share it with your friends and family, that would be amazing, and they would appreciate the support. Thank you.
And with that, I think we can switch to the Q&A if there are any questions that you have. And I think Heidi Altman, our policy director, is going to be leading us on that.
Thank you, Azadeh and Maria, for the presentation. So much impactful and important information, and so timely today, as Mary Meg mentioned at the outset. There have been a lot of questions about what we're hearing from leadership, both in Congress and in the executive branch, in response to the allegations of brutality on the visuals that we all saw of brutality on the border yesterday, but also the Haitian deportation flights. I had dropped in some information about a floor speech that Senator Schumer gave today, but I was wondering if one or both of you could jump in and flesh out a little bit more about what we are and aren't hearing from leadership in Congress and the executive.
I actually was just going to ask my colleague who tracks the Biden administration statements on immigration, because I just realized I don't think I've heard anything yet. I don't know if others have heard anything from the president or Secretary Mayorkas in relation to this brutalization and the deportation flights. I know that the press secretary sort of tried to evade questions surrounding the brutality yesterday, but I haven't heard anything else. I know that the secretary is testifying in the Senate at a hearing on Homeland Security right now, so perhaps he was asked about it. I can find out. Azadeh, have you heard anything else?
Just the Washington Post has reported that Secretary Mayorkas has committed to investigating the incidents that there's been many photos circulating yesterday of Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection agents on horseback using what looks like whips against Haitians and Haitian families, Haitian asylum seekers. Really horrific images of historic resonance, obviously, in this country, and they have committed to investigate those incidents. And Jen Psaki, the press secretary, has also commented that they are looking into them. The one thing I will say is just, you know, one of the most important aspects of these horrific incidents is that sometimes we are just shocked in the moment and just continue on. And what's missing oftentimes is a reflection on the fact that, you know, how it is possible that we got to this point, how it is possible that such images of graphic violence and racial violence are you know, popping up in our feeds in relation to the border. And again, I think the report provides some historical context as to why racial dynamics, politics of racial control in relation to border policies have been part and parcel of the US response, as well as the response of other wealthy Western countries.
Thanks, Azadeh. That resonates a lot today. There's an interesting question in the chat that I will ask either or both of you to respond to, which is, I'll just read it, that in the United Kingdom, the government presents resettlement as the right to seek asylum, and then essentially differentiates between those who are considered to be resettling through that right to seek asylum and those who are deemed, quote, irregular arrivals. And so the person who asked this question says, we support resettlement, but know that it will never meet the need. How do you address this dichotomy in the United States? So I think that there's a few interesting dichotomies to tease out there. One is a pretty significant dichotomy in the US law between refugees and asylum seekers and all others. And then refugees, anyone who meets the definition of a refugee and all others. So Azadeh or Maria, just one of you want to flesh that out a little bit more?
Yeah, that's such an insightful comment. I'll just point you to one thing, which is this is very much one of the tactics to distract the public from the fundamental right to seek asylum. And that particular tactic is to pit refugees against asylum seekers. We actually have a section in the report on page 37 where we talk about how Australia does that routinely in terms of basically saying that, you know, refugees are doing this, again, the right way. They are, you know, coming in an orderly fashion. Their arrival is predictable. And all of that has to do with the fact that, you know, these nations get to exercise control over their arrival, and they get to pick and choose who they're admitting. So in the case of Australia, for example, they routinely had a record of admitting Christian refugees and putting Muslim asylum seekers in those remote islands in the Pacific. So that kind of response, I think, speaks volumes. And we're seeing that as well with, unfortunately, this administration in the United States, where in the very week that, you know, we're seeing these brutal images in relation to Haitian asylum seekers at the border, we're hearing the Biden administration say that they're going to raise the cap on refugees by October. So again, there's a penalization of asylum seekers simply because of the mode of entry that they have at their disposal, even though they are exercising their lawful right to seek asylum.
Thanks, Azadeh. We have one last question, and then I think we can wrap, coming from Patricia, about, especially given the point you just raised, Azadeh, between pitting refugees and asylum seekers, is that now there are many people arriving in the United States with neither status who have evacuated or fled what is happening in Afghanistan. And so if one of you can speak a little bit to where that precarious legal status sits, and what options Congress and or the executive branch seem to be offering, that would be great. One of you want to raise a hand?
I'll just say something really quick, and then Ozde, it'd be great if you could speak to this. But I think what's happening right now with the Haitians in Del Rio is that there needs to be some form of, like, these individuals need to be paroled into the United States. So obviously being in legal limbo is not something that anyone wants, but there needs to be some sort of comparable emergency response to help these individuals, like, immediately, because this is an emergency. They shouldn't be being put on deportation flights. So that's the only thing I'll just add there. But Ozzy, do you want to speak to the rest of the question?
Just to echo that, I think Representatives Presley and Velasquez last week have made similar calls in relation to Haitian asylum seekers. They have called for the use of parole, which has been used in the context of Afghan evacuees. So there's ways in which essentially we're seeing some vehicles being used for one population but not the other, and there's really no need why those tools should be used disparately. In relation to Afghans, the situation with Afghanistan is obviously extremely complex, and the US's involvement in creating that refugee crisis is very hands-on compared to perhaps other nations where that nexus is a little bit more remote. But the asks that we have echoed as a community as well have been to move towards permanency for those communities. So that does not look like parole in a long-term basis, because parole does not entitle individuals to being in the US with stable status. But it does look like essentially streamlining procedures for protection so that Afghans can obtain either lawful permanent status or other forms of complementary protection related to the Immigration and Nationality Act. So there are proposals that we certainly support, and there's ways in which this crisis, again, sort of should ring a huge alarm for us, because if there's the first response when there's empathy is to try to carve out a different process for the population that is impacted. That shows us that the current system as we have it is truly broken. So there's a real need for the Biden administration to not just undo the harm of the past 4 years and undo the harm of the past 9 months, frankly, but also to raise the bar and really challenge the use of asylum, to basically have it meet the promise that the US had made in joining those treaties.
I think I am tasked with wrapping us up. I want to, first of all, ask everyone to please provide feedback. We do really love hearing what you enjoyed and what you think we could do better in our presentations. You can either scan the QR code in the presentation, or I dropped the link, and we'll follow up by email as well. 2 other quick points. One is that I just want to acknowledge very sincere gratitude to Azadeh and to Maria for the work that they did on this report, the countless interviews with experts, and their sharing of their own very deep expertise and analytical insights with us today. It is really refreshing and important to see history brought to bear to the moment that we are all living through today. We're also grateful to so many of you for joining us today and for joining with us in remembering that we have to remain vigilant against normalizing the anti-asylum policies that we saw before the Trump administration, during the Trump administration, and see continued today, and the racism that are imbued in them. And I just, instead of using my own words, I'm going to actually close us with a question that was just asked in the chat. And I thank the participant who wrote it, which is, racism seems to play a significant role in the US expulsions of refugees. How can racism be addressed in a nation literally built on racist practices? We obviously are not going to be able to answer that question in our 15-minute segment today, but I think I'm grateful that we're asking the question and talking about it, and grateful to you all for doing that with us today. We hope you'll join us for the next one, and please join me in thanking Azadeh and Maria, and we will see you next time.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye.